Hello, welcome. Thank you for attending. Pardon me as I get your names down, okay? So as we're moving along, are there any questions? Go ahead and feel free to unmute yourself, should you have one. Sorry, it takes me a moment to do this. There are quite a few of you, which is a great sign. Remember that you have until Sunday evening to do this. You have multiple submissions. Great. I have your names down. So now I'm going to go ahead and put up the test. All right. So let's see here. All right. So with Native Americans, what you need to remember is remember so many of the answers to my tests, and I'm not sure that's a good thing, but they emanate from my argumentative assignments. Okay, so many of them. And so number one is a case in point. It comes from the first number of your argumentative assignments. And so you have problems with a lack of sufficient primary sources with Native Americans as far as troubles getting into devising a narrative of Native American history before Columbus. So you have a scarcity of primary sources, and science could only, quote, go so far. And then the secondary source, or I guess you would consider it a primary source somewhat, of the middle, the early modern era, the European chroniclers. They make the argument that people by nature are ethnocentric, and even those with the best of intentions are going to be limited in how well they could put together a history of another group from another continent. And then not to mention the fact that they have axes to grind sometimes. This is a very simple, obvious one, is justifying what they did, justifying conquest. So it's tough to rely upon the chronicles as well. And then science can only go so far, right? We talked about C. Vance Haynes' theory of the Bering Strait crossing. And they thought for sure that it was about 13,000 years ago in the Wisconsin era ice age. And then they carbon dated some stuff in South America to be 30,000 years old. So much for that theory, if the carbon-14 dating can be trusted. And so you have problems with that. And then also those who try to put, biological ties between those from Siberia and Eurasia and Native America. We went over that as well, and there's no consensus on that. And as far as some of the biological studies of the 1990s. And so all of those serve as instances in which we're not satisfied currently with the ability to surmise Native American history before the arrival of the Europeans. Okay. And then with number two, it's addressed in number two of your argumentative assignment. And so we talked about the European barometer or criteria, the measuring stick utilized by anthropologists to this day to try to surmise just how civilized, culturally evolved a certain group is. And I'm not sure how fair that is, but it is what it is. And so it has been manipulation of the environment, development of a complex society, artistic expression, knowledge of the sciences and technology, and then their religious beliefs as well. And so they Yeah, it is what it is, as unfair as that is. And so, at any rate, but even going by the Europeans' game, if you will, the Native Americans, according to the book 1491, they fared pretty well chronologically, especially knowing that they could not piggyback off of others as the Europeans could. The Europeans are contiguous through the Mediterranean and through Turkey to the Near East and to Asia. And so they're able to piggyback off of things technologically, up through the Crusades, etc. Get culturally borrow from other groups, and the Native Americans could not. But nevertheless, like their Neolithic, their new stone tool or farming revolution was pretty darn early, uh, uh, even compared to the old world comparisons in the Near East and Asia and Africa, etc. All right, and so let's see here, and remember also that according to the historical narrative, they're still learning more about the Adena, but as far as meeting a lot of those European devised criteria, they met it pretty darn well in the form of the Pueblo people in the Southwest and along the Mississippi River pretty early on, and so that's just part of the narrative. I don't like that narrative, but it is what it is. As far as the Native Americans trying to defend how civilized they were, as if they have to live by the European criteria, and as if they in doing so that it's a necessity to claim that they shouldn't have been dispossessed of their land. But at any rate, that's what you find in many narratives, is them trying to justify just how civilized the Native Americans were. And not that they didn't meet that criteria well, but just the fact that they have to, just at any rate, it's just a whole other can of worms. And so at any rate, cultural traits that they share, that was I think the final number of the last argumentative section of the first assignment. And so you saw animism, shamanism, polytheism, pantheism, and their differences when it came to private property, their notions of private property. And so, so you have that. And then, of course, the two stereotypical images of the Native Americans by European chroniclers are innocent and childlike, right, by like Las Casas, calling them meek sheep, or bestial savages like Sepulveda, and a little bit conveyed by Castillo. All right, and so are there any questions on numbers 1 through 4? All right, so I'm gonna keep steaming through if that's all right. And so moving on to the Spanish. The Spanish colonization by today's standards, of course, is very inequitable, is very hierarchical, very undemocratic, very ethnocentric, right? The Spanish came in and they had their own worldview, and they imposed that worldview to such a degree, right, that they've served as a convenient anti-model for today's values, fair or unfair to the Spanish, which the Spanish, of course, call the Black Legend. So they came in, right, and by today's standards, they were very religiously zealous, ethnocentric, certainly not democratic, and they were unapologetic about being so. And remember, this is the early modern era, just coming from the medieval time period, and they had just finished fighting a reconquista against the Muslim Moors of North Africa. And so, so you've got to consider the context. And let's see here. At the time of Spanish colonization, Western Europe was arguably slowly transitioning toward a limitedly and brutally capitalistic economy. Yes, I make that argument on number 1 of the Southern Colonies handout, and I make that argument also on number 1 of the Black Legend handout. Okay, and so that was being conveyed because remember, they were technically a mercantilist economy, but it was beginning to open up when it came to trade with the Orient, with Asia, with the East, and with the quote discovery of the Americas and early colonization thereof. All right, let's see here. Contributions, when you get simply into functional history as to how we got to where we are today. Of course, right, the Spanish brought a monotheistic belief in the Christian God, in the Judeo-Christian God, Roman and Germanic law, modern notions of private property, modern manner of urban development. They also brought Hispanic culture, right? What we have today as Hispanic culture. And so all of that is all of those are true. Notice one of them is not. Let's see here, to give credit where credit is due, the Spanish did have a system of accountability, and it was argued by one of the books that I cited in the handout, that it may have been a lesser evil to have been a slave under the Spanish than under the English. So both of those were noted in defending the Spanish. Not to mention the argument, right, that it's unfair to utilize today's worldview and today's standards and values and mores to judge the early modern Spaniards. All that is argumentative. Las Casas, his brief relation of the destruction of the Indies, did openly sympathize with the Native Americans. He was on an agenda to try to have them protected as a demographic, and that is true. Castillo also went in a different direction. Remember, he was a comrade to Hernan Cortez in the conquest of Mexico, and he wrote what he contended was the true history of the conquest, as opposed to what Las Casas and others had written in accordance to the Black legend. And he defended the Spanish, and even somewhat vilifying the Mexica or the Aztec. All right, so we went over that. Sahagún, absolutely. To me, he represents the contention that even the most well-meaning Spaniards in the early modern period who went out of their way to try to protect the Native Americans, to try to conserve their history and their culture, etc. Even people like himself still wanted the Native Americans to assimilate, to drop their culture and embrace that of the Spaniards, and took a very paternalistic stance towards the Native Americans. And then with Junipero Serra, I thought subjectively that he symbolizes the juxtaposition of the hagiographies praising the Spanish friars and priests for their selfless sacrifices and protection of their neophyte Native Americans on the missions, with the more modern revisionist historiography of them being ethnocentric tyrants, forcing Spanish traditions and ways and institutions upon the unwilling and unwitting Native Americans. Don Juan de Oñate, I subjectively would utilize him if I had to write in accordance to the Black legend and had to do a little bit of great man history of leaders and try to vilify them as an anti-model for today. He may have been one of my choices, Don Juan de Oñate in New Mexico. He seems to have done, by today's standards, so many things wrongly, for lack of a better adverb. Just very intolerant, sometimes even brutal, very inequitable, lots of nepotism and corruption, etc., and manipulation from the sources I've read. One of them I have cited in your argumentative assignment, the When Jesus Came, the Corn Mothers Went Away by Gutierrez. Let's see here. The regions claimed by the Spaniards in present day Estados Unidos, right, or US, everywhere except the Northeast, you should find. So you're looking for the one that doesn't fit. So if anything is mentions the Northeast, I've not read anything of that sort, like Massachusetts, etc. All right. Let's see here. So which of the following was not mentioned in characterizing Spanish colonization of the Americas? The Spanish colonizers were, by today's standards, religiously ethnocentric. Absolutely. Just too much evidence to support that. Spanish authorities generally intended the Spanish Americas to be hierarchical. That was on one particular section. and there is evidence for that. Like I said, they were unapologetic. They weren't living today. They didn't have today's egalitarian worldview, and so yeah, of course they didn't. And then of course you could look at the Dutch, you could look at the English, look at the others. Were they any better? And of course, I almost say that as a rhetorical question. I would say no, they weren't in that respect. The Spanish colony of New Mexico was depicted as anomalously out of the ordinary, tolerant and democratic. No, like I said, I would choose Spanish New Mexico in support of the Black legend if I were to be given the task of writing something on in support of the Black legend in U.S. territory. And in reality, and in some places more so than in others, the average colonized man had limited economic opportunities and a slight voice in government. And I would make that argument with the cabildos, the city councils, and the position of the alcalde mayor. There was limited self-government at the local level. You had the juez de residencia and other instances in which the people had some say and some opportunities for accountability of their Spanish rulers. And then also with the mercantilist restrictions under the Council of Trade, the House of Trade in Spain, they allowed the common people to eat the proverbial crumbs off the table. They monopolized the big money makers like sugar and cocoa and tobacco and slavery. A lot of other things they allowed people to engage in an entrepreneurial and merchant basis. Let's see here, the textbook. I especially want to just kind of give you these because you may or may not have received your textbook. Hopefully you have by now, but just in case you haven't, but I probably will not, okay, on test 2 and 3. I'll leave the textbook questions up to you. Even when I go over the week of the test, I'll probably leave those to you. But in this case, I will, not having registered your book through the school. The textbook illustrates how French colonization exercised an influence disproportionate to their numbers. And this is almost contradictory to the image that I conveyed in the argumentative handout, isn't it? But it is true. The textbook does state that their influence was disproportionately larger than their small numbers, particularly regarding the fur trade. All right. The textbook claims that rigid royal Spanish policy stifled economic development in the Americas. Yes, right. So there's a capitalist bent to your writer, Alan Brinkley, of the textbook, and he contends, right, that the strict mercantilist restrictions of Spain stifled enterprise in the Americas. And again, that's somewhat argumentative. Number 18, a section from the Southern Colonies handout contends that colonial Virginia afforded an economically and politically equal playing field for all English colonists. That's the last number of your Black Legend handout. Of course not, right? Of course not. And so then number 19, is there an instance in your argumentative handout on the Southern Colonies of court history, right? And I'll state that there was a gentleman, right, who wrote a book called, David Price, wrote a book called Love and Hate in Jamestown, and he did just that. So in court history, they do praise John Smith as a man who earned merited his leadership position, and they justify what the English did vis-a-vis the Powhatan tribe and their conflicts with the Powhatan tribe. Helen Roundtree, take a look at the one cited before that, and clearly you'll see that it's from the Native American perspective, highlighting their agency and vilifying the English. Okay, so what instance was not mentioned in the handout as far as agency? So the Powhatan, the fact that they could have wiped out the English early was conveyed, that argument. The Huron and Natchez and other tribes of the Mississippi River almost kind of bullying the French. You'll find that. African-American slaves in the book Black Majority, taking advantage of an acute need for their labor, and of all places, ironically, South Carolina. I say that ironically because it became very inequitable and very oppressive in the future when it became a royal colony. Nothing was stated of women. And let's see here, number 22, Alan Brinkley contends in the textbook that the Spanish command over Indian labor did not fully meet the demands for labor, so they opted for African slaves subsequently. So the economic argument for slavery, as opposed to the racist argument, very subjective, very argumentative, but Brinkley takes that economic route. Yes, he does. Let's see here. Which of the following was mentioned as factual support of the thesis that slavery was not a racist, but a practical and convenient institution? Find that straight from your handout, okay? And you'll find that there was a scarcity of white indentured servants, that they developed a reputation for rebelliousness and entitlement, the alleged biological success of the African slaves, contending that they were sturdier, the fact that the numbers, it's not on there, but the numbers of slaves available actually constituted a, quote, glut at one point in the late 1600s. And so the price of slaves went down at one point where it was just 5 shillings more to buy a slave for life and to be entitled to the slave's progeny than messing with an indentured servant for only 3 to 7 years. So it became economically alluring, sadly, right? And then also there was diplomacy with the Native Americans. They're trying to make peace with them, so they didn't want to enslave them and start up new wars. Wars were expensive and resources, etc. Howard Zinn and his take on Bacon's rebellion is negative, because Howard Zinn is a conflict historian. He's a Marxist historian. So he believes that the rich are parasites in American history. They're villains. They manipulated. They devised, tactics of divide and conquer nature to take advantage of other people, right? And so you're looking at a dark and gloomy image for number 24. You're looking for that option of that type of situation with Bacon's rebellion of the ex-indentured servants of the Piedmont area of Virginia against the Tidewater elite. Let's see here. Conditions endured by slaves. Remember Fogel and Ingerman, the handout goes against that, right? Goes against Fogel and Ingerman's thesis, contending that slaves were not treated well on account of being expensive and it being the best interest of the masters to have them in good health and strong, etc. That there's just too much evidence against it. And you have primary source accounts from the madams, their diaries and written letters of correspondence. You have physiological evidence of excavation of skeletal remains. You have evidence of rebellion amongst the slaves, even under the harshest of circumstances, right, in which they knew there would be great harsh reactions to their behavior. They still engaged in rebellious behavior. So the argument was made, right, is they must have been pretty miserable and pretty desperate to have engaged in such behavior. And the slave codes were pretty draconian as well. All right, and then French Louisiana, which you need to remember by 26 is from the handout, is that the fluidity found in French Louisiana was arguably by accident, by chance, and not by design of its leaders, right? So look back at that and you'll see the argument for that, mainly, right, a scarcity of resources. But you take a look at that. And the French were depicted in the handout, right, as being bullied themselves, not being the bullies. And so look at that when it stresses the agency of the Mississippian tribes agency, their strength, their decisions to manipulate the French. All right. Notice I put to choose the answer because I don't know if I'd gone over this. And David Hackett Fisher's Albion Seed, he just contends that the demographic that established first effective settlement over a given colony, they made it in its own image. They brought cultural baggage of their own ways of devising their institutions of family, government, church, etc. Right? They tried to replicate those things that they were familiar with, their class of people and their particular region and socioeconomic position back in England. They tried to replicate everything of their own. And so hence, it's a simplistic dichotomy, but he says that in the northern sections, a lot of bourgeois people from cities and artisans and middling folk, the beginnings of a middle class, colonized the north. And then a lot of gentrymen and very poor people from England moved to the south. So it's simplistic. There are always a myriad of exceptions. And I thought it was interesting, and that there has to be some truth to it with the stats that he puts in there. And so in the South, right, he contends basically, this leads to the historiography of the Civil War, contending that the South was kind of backward, right, with these backward conservative aristocrats and these poor from the streets indentured servants, etc. So I take a look at C, that doesn't really seem to fit. All right, Roger Williams and William Penn were depicted as being idealistic in granting freedom of religion in their respective colonies, that it may have emanated from a good place that we would expect today by today's standards. The Dutch New Netherlands, this covers at least two questions. I made the very argumentative point, which can be rebutted, that tolerance under the Dutch was more pragmatic. It was more economically oriented, right? That they just simply put up with and tolerated certain demographics and individuals because they were helping the New Netherlands and the Dutch West India Company succeed economically, all right, but not idealistically out of the goodness of their hearts and out of some type of, egalitarian worldview. Let's see here. William Penn, you see court history on 30 and 31, and both of those are conveyed in the handout of him having this, almost despotic power and him giving it up and allowing the legislator, but nothing was put about the pressure upon him to do such, but it was just kind of implied that he did it of his own volition and he did it immediately, which is somewhat stretching the truth. Okay, so you got to always remember that when you're reading your argumentative assignments. I don't put false information that I know of. I like to think with the research I do, that it's verified by an historian, whatever facts I'm putting in there. But I'm being very selective, and I'm in what I'm omitting conveniently from my thesis. So always keep that in mind. Let's see here. With New England, right, you have with 30, 32, and 33, you have both those images juxtaposed, that New England was very progressive, ahead of its time. You find that in number 1 of the handout, the first section, and then it's covered by number 2, or it's countered by number 2, whereby you see a much more xenophobic, overbearing, tyrannical side to the Puritans in particular of New England, right? So keep that in mind for 32 and 33. Let's see here. We've already covered 34, due at least partially to economic concerns. That was the argument conveyed in the handout. So that's what you'd be looking for. All right. So many of the answers are found in the argumentative assignments. Then going back to the book on 35, according to Alan Brinkley, the British Navigation Acts were stifling to American colonists. No, they were not. And I'm not going to elaborate on that because we're going to do it first thing after the test when we do the War for Independence. Which of the following is false regarding the Sacred Expedition? Remember, it was supposed to have been a peaceful alternative to conquest, and they were to secure the domains that they had and not try to conquer any further ones. And they'd already claimed Alta California or Upper California in 1540 through Cabrillo and his voyages. And so at any rate, they were just simply trying to make good and pacifying the land that they had already claimed. And they tried to do it through missions, cities or pueblos, presidios or military forts, and haciendas or plantations. And they definitely brought with them a paternalistic worldview. But that court history has been subjected to a lot of rebuttals, right? Whereby a more modern historiography would depict it in more of a Marxist conflict history fashion and contend that the Spanish were guilty of cultural genocide and that they were extremely ethnocentric in forcing the Native Americans to convert to their ways. All right. The St. Lawrence River and Ohio Valley were briefly mentioned as instances of the Iroquois and other tribes, right, taking advantage of a situation economically to try to corner the fur trade and to make the Europeans come to them and trade for the fur on their terms. So it's an instance of agency, right? Because remember, with agency, different demographics that have been considered minorities that in conflict history books have been depicted as passive victims. Ever since the civil rights movement, historians have wanted to convey the fact that even those groups as well were human agents with free will and by their own volition made decisions that mattered and helped dictate the course of events, even if those decisions in the long run were not beneficial to them, right? As in the case of Native Americans, because clearly they were dispossessed. St. Augustine is the oldest surviving city, Euro-American city, 1565 in Florida. Just a kind of random fact that I thought I'd throw in there. Puritan societal notion of the covenant is tied to a very conflict-ridden history in New England. Certainly not tolerance, right? Remember, the notion of the covenant was that God makes a covenant with communities, according to the New England Puritans and Pilgrims, particularly the Puritans. And the people, as long as people abide by God's laws and his values, then he will bless the society. But if they don't, he will basically curse it. He'll turn his back on the society. And so hence, they had select men that would come and spy on people in their homes to make sure that they were not going to incur the wrath of God upon the entire community. And then number 40, Tories in the English Parliament during the 1770s allied themselves with the colonists? No, they were the party in Parliament that wanted to put the American colonists in their place. They were the conservatives. And we'll get to that just after the test when we cover the War for Independence. All right, and so that's it for me. Are there any questions? Any particular questions? All right. Can I get a thumbs up from anybody? Have you guys been able to hear me the whole time and see this page? Thank you. Thank you for your thumbs up. I appreciate that. I really do. Thank you. Okay, and so I'm happy to give you guys, I might even give you 10. I'm going to give you 5 to 10 extra credit points. So notice the test consists of 40 questions. I give you the final 10 and make it out of 50 as a curve. So I'm gonna give you guys 15 to 20 points in addition to your raw score for staying here with me on the test. All right, so I hope that makes it worthwhile. I hope this was of some assistance for you. And I believe
Yes,
I have
thank
everyone's name. Yeah, someone have a comment?
No, I just said it was helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Jolene. All right. All right, you guys. So I'll go ahead and let you go, but you guys have a great week. Be safe. And note, this is the only of the 3 tests that you have unlimited submissions. So by all means, keep taking it until you ace it. All right, on the first test. I wish you well. And I really, really appreciate, just taking a little bit of effort week to week to share the information that I'm privy to with you. I really appreciate seeing, lots of names up here and you guys just present. And I wish we could meet in person, but this is the next best thing. So thank you. All right, so have a great week. I'm going to go ahead and sign off, okay? All right, bye-bye.